The models refused to wear it. The million-dollar dress, the star of the show, was tearing itself apart under the lights. The designer screamed, blaming his team, but the old black laundress in the basement looked at a single dropped thread and knew the truth. It wasn't the fabric. It was the stitch. And she knew because she was the one who invented it. To the glamorous, high-strung world of Atelier Devereaux, one of New York's most elite fashion houses, Martha was a ghost. At 72, she was a small, stooped woman with hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, her silver hair always tucked neatly under a simple scarf. She was the head laundress, a creature of the steam-filled basement, the silent guardian of silks and cashmeres. Her domain was a world of whirring machines, the scent of expensive detergent, and the quiet dignity of a job done perfectly. The designers, the models, the executives, they looked through her as if she were made of glass. They saw the uniform, the dark skin, the age, and their minds stopped there. They never suspected they were looking at Martha Dubois, a master weaver and textile artisan who had once run her own small, acclaimed studio. A woman whose revolutionary techniques with natural fibers had been on the verge of changing the industry before her business was ruthlessly crushed and her designs stolen by a larger, more powerful corporation. That corporation was Devereaux. The crisis began in the final week before New York Fashion Week, in the pristine, white-walled design studio on the penthouse floor. The entire show, the entire season, hinged on one garment, the starlight gown. It was a marvel of textile engineering, a dress woven from a new, bioluminescent silk that was supposed to shimmer and flow like liquid light. It was Julian Vance's masterpiece. Julian, at 29, was the wunderkind of the fashion world. He was brilliant, arrogant, and worshipped by the press. He didn't design clothes. He created wearable art, and the starlight gown was to be his coronation. But the masterpiece was failing. In every fitting, under the heat of the powerful runway lights, the dress would begin to tear. Not a simple rip, but a catastrophic structural failure. The micro-thin seams would unravel, and the shimmering fabric would lose its integrity, turning from liquid light into a dull, lifeless rag. "This is unacceptable," Julian shrieked, his voice echoing in the tense studio. He threw a pair of shears against a wall, making his team of young, terrified assistants flinch. "The fabric is a disaster. The engineers are incompetent. Do you know what this will do to my reputation?" His team had no answers. They had rewoven the fabric, redesigned the seams, consulted with textile engineers from 3 continents. Nothing worked. The dress, and Julian's reputation, were coming apart at the seams. Down in the basement laundry, Martha received the damaged prototypes. Each day, another ruined gown would arrive in her canvas bin, a shimmering, expensive corpse. The assistants who brought them down spoke in hushed, panicked tones, never noticing the old woman listening as she carefully sorted the delicate fabrics. But Martha wasn't just listening. She was looking. Her fingers, which could read the story of a fabric better than most people could read a book, traced the lines of the torn seams. Her eyes, trained by a lifetime of understanding the secret language of thread, saw what the engineers' microscopes had missed. The problem wasn't the fabric. The fabric was a miracle. The problem was the stitch. They were using a standard, high-tension machine stitch, a technique designed for strength and speed. But this new bio-silk wasn't a normal fabric. It was alive in a way. It expanded and contracted with heat. It had a memory. The rigid, unforgiving stitch was fighting the fabric's natural movement, strangling it, forcing it to tear itself apart under the stress of the lights. It needed a different kind of stitch. A stitch that was both strong and flexible, a stitch that moved with the fabric, honoring its life. A stitch that Martha herself had perfected decades ago, before Julian Vance had even been born. The interlocking weft, she had called it. A technique Devereaux had stolen from her when they drove her out of business. She tried to say something. She approached a young, kind-faced assistant who was close to tears after one of Julian's tirades. "Excuse me, dear," Martha said, her voice soft and raspy. She held up a piece of the ruined fabric. "I was just noticing the way the thread is pulling here. Have you considered using a cross-tension hand stitch on the bias?" The assistant stared at her, her expression a mixture of confusion and pity. "A what?" "Ma'am, please, we have textile engineers working on this. It's very complicated. She took the fabric from Martha's hand. "Thank you for your concern, but maybe you should just focus on the laundry." The dismissal was gentle, but it was a dismissal all the same. Martha nodded and retreated to her steam presses, the familiar sting of being unseen settling in her chest. She knew then that a quiet suggestion would not be enough. If the starlight gown was to be saved, the ghost in the basement would have to find a way to make the gods on the penthouse floor listen. The dismissal from the young assistant, though gentle, was a familiar sting. Martha retreated to the steamy sanctuary of her basement, the scent of bleach and hot cotton a strange comfort. She had spent 30 years learning to be invisible, to swallow her knowledge, to be nothing more than the woman who pressed their shirts. But the sight of the ruined starlight gown stirred something she thought had long since died, the pride of an artist. She couldn't stand by and watch them destroy a beautiful fabric because of their own blind arrogance. More than that, she couldn't watch them fail because of a problem created by their own theft. The interlocking weft stitch was hers. She had developed it in her small studio, a technique born from her deep understanding of how natural fibers breathe and move. Devereaux had stolen it, patented it under their own name, and then, in a final act of supreme irony, their modern engineers had forgotten how to use it properly. That evening, as the last of the frantic assistants left for the night, Martha made a decision. Her quiet hint had been ignored. It was time for a louder whisper. She waited until the building was hollow and silent, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe in her laundry. With the careful, deliberate movements of a ghost, she took the service elevator up to the penthouse floor. The design studio was a pristine white tomb, haunted by the ghost of the failing dress. A single prototype hung on a mannequin in the center of the room, a shimmering, tragic failure. From her apron pocket, Martha pulled a small bundle she had carefully prepared, a scrap of the precious biosilk she had salvaged from the laundry bin, a needle, and a spool of the specialized thread. The scrap was no bigger than her hand. She sat on a low stool before the mannequin, the gown looming over her like a silent judge. For a moment, she simply looked at it, her gnarled fingers tracing the failed, rigid seams. "You poor thing," she whispered to the dress. "They don't know how to listen to you." Then, she began to sew. Her hands, which were stiff with arthritis during the day, became fluid and sure. The needle danced through the fabric, not with the brute force of a machine, but with the intimate knowledge of a partner. She didn't just stitch, she wove, her needle following the natural grain of the silk, creating the interlocking weft. It was a stitch that created a seam that was not a scar, but a spine, strong yet flexible, a living part of the garment. She worked for nearly an hour on that tiny scrap, her focus absolute. When she was finished, she had created a small, perfect patch of shimmering fabric. She held it under the harsh glare of a desk lamp. She pulled at it gently, then with more force. The seam held. It stretched and moved with the fabric, a perfect synthesis of strength and grace. She didn't leave it on the table. That would be too easily dismissed. Instead, she found the lead model's fitting notes, a clipboard filled with measurements and panicked comments about the tearing. With a piece of simple white thread, she carefully stitched her small, perfect sample directly onto the corner of the top page. It was a quiet statement, a piece of irrefutable, physical evidence. A single, perfect stitch in a storm of failure. Then, as silently as she had arrived, she returned to her basement world, leaving her ghost of a solution behind. The next morning, the studio was once again a hive of panic. The premiere was now less than a week away. Julian Vance arrived in a storm of fury, his face pale with sleeplessness. "Has anyone solved it yet?" he demanded, his voice already on the edge of a shriek. "Or am I surrounded by useless, overpaid children?" It was then that the lead assistant, the same kind-faced girl Martha had spoken to, picked up the fitting notes. She stopped, her eyes widening as she saw the small, shimmering patch of fabric stitched to the page. "What is this?" she whispered, her fingers tracing the impossibly perfect seam. Julian snatched the clipboard from her hands. He stared at the sample, his arrogance momentarily replaced by sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He pulled at it. He twisted it. The seam held. It moved like it was part of the fabric itself. "Where did this come from?" he demanded, holding up the clipboard. "Who did this?" No one had an answer. The assistants exchanged confused glances. The textile engineers, patched in on a video call, leaned closer to their screens, baffled. "It looks like a modified cross-tension stitch," one of the engineers said, "but the interlocking mechanism. I've never seen anything like it. It's brilliant. Theoretically impossible with this fiber." Julian's eyes scanned the room, a frantic, desperate energy about him. Someone in this building did this. Someone solved it and left it as a riddle. Who? The young assistant hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Yesterday, the laundress, Martha, she said something to me. About a cross-tension stitch." Julian stared at her, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a high, hysterical sound, devoid of any real humor. "The laundress?" he screeched. "The old woman who washes our towels? You're telling me she solved a problem that has stumped the best minds in the industry? Don't be ridiculous." He was about to throw the clipboard down in disgust, but he stopped. He looked again at the small, perfect sample. The proof was in his hands. Arrogant as he was not a fool. He knew he was looking at a miracle. "Find her," he hissed, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "Get that old woman up here. Now." The summons from the penthouse was a seismic event in the quiet, ordered world of the basement. The young assistant who came to fetch Martha looked terrified, as if she were leading a lamb to the slaughter. "Mr. Vance wants to see you," she stammered, avoiding Martha's eyes. He found the sample." Martha simply nodded, calmly wiping her hands on her apron. She followed the assistant into the sleek, silent elevator, a ghost ascending from the underworld into the heavens of haute couture. The design studio was a vortex of tension. Julian Vance stood in the center of the room, holding the clipboard with her stitched sample as if it were a holy relic. His team of assistants and engineers stood in a wide, fearful circle around him. "You," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss as Martha entered. "Did you do this?" He held up the sample. Martha looked at the small, perfect patch of fabric, then met his gaze. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The room held its breath. Julian stared at her, his brilliant mind struggling to reconcile the image of the stooped, elderly laundress with the impossible genius of the stitch. "How?" he finally managed to ask. "Our engineers, the best in the world, said it was impossible. They were trying to force the fabric," Martha said simply. "This fiber doesn't like to be forced. It needs to be persuaded. You have to work with its memory, not against it." Her words were simple, but they spoke of a deep, intuitive knowledge that made the engineers on the video screen shift uncomfortably. Julian's arrogance, for a moment, was replaced by a raw, desperate curiosity. He was a man who worshipped at the altar of innovation, and he had just found a new god in the most unlikely of temples. "Show me," he commanded, his voice now stripped of its usual theatricality. "Show me how you did it." He gestured to the failed starlight gown on the mannequin. "Fix it." The entire team watched in a state of suspended disbelief as the old laundress walked to the mannequin. She didn't look at Julian or his team. She only had eyes for the dress. With a quiet reverence, she ran her gnarled fingers over the shimmering, ruined fabric. "I will need a clean workspace," she said, her voice carrying an authority that no one dared to question. "And I will need silence." For the next 5 hours, the penthouse design studio was transformed. The chaotic, high-pressure workshop became a silent, sacred space. Martha worked at a large cutting table, the starlight gown spread out before her like a patient on an operating table. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands, which had seemed so stiff and old in the laundry, now impossibly fluid and precise. She didn't use any of their high-tech machines. She worked entirely by hand, with a simple needle and thread. She began by carefully unpicking the failed, rigid seams the machines had created. Then, with a focus that was absolute, she began to restitch the gown, her needle weaving the interlocking weft that was her own lost legacy. Julian and his team watched in complete silence, mesmerized. They were witnessing not just a master at work, but a form of magic they had never imagined. They had spent weeks trying to solve the problem with technology and data. Martha was solving it with something far older and more powerful, a deep, cellular understanding of her craft. She wasn't just sewing a dress, she was communing with it. As she worked, The dress began to transform. The dead, lifeless fabric came alive under her hands. The seams, once a source of weakness, became a source of strength, flowing with the natural lines of the silk. When she finished the final stitch, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the studio. The starlight gown was no longer a failed prototype. It was a masterpiece, whole and perfect. Martha stepped back from the table, her work complete. Julian approached the gown as if it were a sacred object. He touched the seams, his fingers tracing the impossible stitch. He lifted the fabric, watching it flow and shimmer in the fading light. It was alive. He turned to Martha, his face a storm of conflicting emotions: awe, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible suspicion. "No laundress could do this," he said, his voice a whisper. "This is the work of a master. Who are you?" Martha met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed a flicker of her old self to show in her eyes. "I am the woman who invented that stitch 30 years ago," she said quietly. "Before your company stole it and tried to forget my name." Before Julian could process this bombshell, the lead textile engineer on the video screen, an older man who had been watching in stunned silence, gasped. "My God," he breathed, his face pale. "I remember now. From my university days. The Du Bois weave. They said it was a myth. The woman who created it, she disappeared after her studio was acquired by Devereaux in a hostile takeover." He looked at Martha's face on the screen, recognition dawning. You're Elena Du Bois." The name dropped into the silent room like a stone. Julian stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying clarity. The stolen stitch. The legendary, forgotten artisan. The ghost in his own basement. He looked at the perfect, shimmering gown, then at the old woman in the simple laundress's uniform. He had built his masterpiece on a stolen foundation, and the architect he had erased from history had just come back to save him from his own ignorance. The name Elena Du Bois hung in the air of the pristine design studio, a ghost that had just been given flesh. Julian Vance stared at Martha, his face a canvas of warring emotions. The shock of discovery, the humiliation of his own ignorance, and the dawning, terrifying realization that his entire career-defining moment was now in the hands of the woman his company had destroyed. The team of assistants and engineers, who had moments before seen only a simple laundress, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and profound shame. They had dismissed her, talked over her, treated her as part of the furniture. Now they knew they had been in the presence of a master. Julian was the first to break the silence, his voice stripped of its usual sharp arrogance, now thin and brittle. I didn't know," he stammered. "The acquisition of your studio, it was before my time. I was just a student." "You built your reputation on my work," Martha said, her voice not accusatory, but a simple statement of fact. "That stitch is the only reason this fabric holds together. You patented it under the Devereaux name. You called it the Vance weave in last month's Vogue." The accusation, delivered so quietly, was more devastating than any shout. The color drained from Julian's face. He had not just used a stolen technique. He had put his own name on it. "We need you," he said finally, the words a surrender. "The premiere is in 3 days. The starlight gown is the centerpiece of the entire collection. Without it, we are ruined." He gestured to the now perfect dress on the table. "You fixed one, but we have 3 more for the show. They're all failing." He was no longer the tyrannical genius commanding his underlings. He was a desperate man begging for a miracle from the ghost he had helped to create. "I will pay you," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Whatever you want. A consultant's fee. Name your price." Martha looked at him, and for the first time, she allowed a flicker of the iron will that had once built a business to show in her eyes. "This is not about money, Mr. Vance. You cannot buy back a stolen legacy." "Then what do you want?" he pleaded. "I want my name back," she said. "I want the world to know who created the stitch that holds your masterpiece together. I want to be credited, publicly, as the co-creator of the starlight gown." The demand was a thunderclap in the silent room. Julian recoiled as if struck. His entire brand, his very identity, was built on the myth of his singular genius. To share credit, especially with an unknown, elderly laundress, was unthinkable. It would be a confession of his own inadequacy, a public humiliation. "I can't do that," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The press, the investors. My entire career is built on this collection being mine. And my entire life's work is woven into the seams of that dress, Martha countered, her voice unwavering. A dress that would fall apart without me. You seem to have a choice, Mr. Vance. Share the credit and have a triumph, or keep it all for yourself and have a catastrophe. The lights of Fashion Week are very bright. They are very good at showing flaws. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. 3 days. That was all the time he had. He looked at the perfect gown, then at the resolute old woman before him. He saw the faces of the critics, the headlines, the ruin that awaited him if he failed. His pride was a bitter pill to swallow, but the alternative was poison. He finally nodded, the movement small and defeated. All right, he said, the word barely audible. You will have your credit. Not just in the program, Martha added, pressing her advantage. I want to be introduced on stage. At the premiere. By you. Julian stared at her, the finality of his defeat settling upon him. He was trapped. The ghost he had ignored in his basement had come upstairs, and she was now the one in control. As you wish, Ms. Du Bois, he said, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. Now, Martha said, her tone shifting from negotiation to command as she turned to the stunned assistants. Bring me the other gowns. We have a great deal of work to do, and we are running out of time. The 3 days leading up to the premiere were a quiet, intense revolution. The penthouse design studio, once Julian Vance's kingdom of fear, became Martha Du Bois's sanctuary of craft. She did not raise her voice or issue commands. She simply worked, and by her example, she taught. The young, terrified assistants, who had once seen her as an invisible menial, now watched her with a reverence they usually reserved for Julian. They became her apprentices, learning to handle the delicate bio-silk not as a product, but as a partner. Julian himself was a ghost in his own studio. He watched, humbled and silent, as the woman he had unknowingly helped to erase from history single-handedly saved his future. He saw the way she worked, with a deep, patient respect for the materials, and in her quiet dignity, he saw a reflection of his own loud, frantic insecurity. On the night of the premiere, the backstage of the Grand Theater was a storm of controlled chaos. Models in shimmering gowns, makeup artists with their brushes, and stagehands with their headsets all moved in a frantic, whispered ballet. At the center of it all, on a specially prepared rack, hung the 3 perfect starlight gowns, shimmering under the lights, alive and waiting. Martha was there, not in her laundress's uniform, but in a simple, elegant dark dress she had made herself. She wasn't an employee, she was a guardian, performing the final checks, ensuring every stitch was perfect. When the starlight gowns made their debut on the runway, a collective gasp went through the audience. The fabric flowed and shimmered exactly as Julian had dreamed, moving with the models like a second skin made of captured moonlight. The dresses didn't just hang, they danced. The seams, once a point of failure, were now invisible sources of strength, a testament to a forgotten genius. The collection was a triumph. When the final model left the stage, the applause was thunderous. Julian Vance walked out to take his bow, his face pale but resolute. He let the applause wash over him for a moment, then raised his hand for silence. Thank you, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Tonight, you have seen my vision. But the vision would have remained a broken dream without the hands and the heart of a true master. He turned towards the wings. There is a name that was stolen from the world of fashion 30 years ago. A name that belongs to the woman who invented the very technique that holds these gowns together. Tonight, it is my profound honor to return that name to its rightful place. Please welcome the co-creator of the Starlight Gown, the master artisan, Elena Du Bois. A ripple of confusion, then astonishment, went through the audience. Who was Elena Du Bois? From the wings, Martha walked onto the stage. In her simple dress, with her gnarled hands and quiet dignity, she was the antithesis of the high-fashion world. She stood beside the young, celebrated designer, not as his subordinate, but as his equal. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then explosive, as the reporters in the front row, smelling the story of a lifetime, began to furiously type on their phones. The next morning, the headlines were not about Julian Vance's genius, but about the ghost of Devereaux. The story of the lost master, the stolen stitch, and the laundress who saved the collection became an instant fashion legend. Devereaux, faced with a PR nightmare, was forced to issue a public apology and open negotiations with Martha's new, very expensive lawyer. Martha Du Bois never returned to the basement. She accepted a settlement from Devereaux that was both a quiet fortune and a public admission of their theft. With it, she did not retire. She opened the Du Bois Textile Studio, a small, independent workshop dedicated to sustainable fabrics and ethical craftsmanship, taking on the kindest of Julian's assistants as her first apprentice. She never sought the spotlight, but it found her. Designers from around the world came to her, not just for her legendary stitch, but for her wisdom. Julian Vance was a frequent visitor, no longer the arrogant prodigy, but a humbled student, learning from the master he had almost failed to see. Martha's greatest triumph was not the fame or the fortune. It was the quiet satisfaction of her name finally being stitched back into the fabric of history, a thread of truth that could never again be torn away. How many masterpieces are lost, not because they are flawed, but because we are too blind to see the artist standing right in front of us? If this story inspired you to look closer at the invisible people who hold our world together, please like, subscribe, and share it. You never know whose hidden genius you might help bring into the light.